We should move on because Sam Harris is wrong about many other things. Do you have the Islam and foreign policy supercut?
And I don't know, but what's troubling me is I don't know where the line is between encouraging moderation, representing what Islam could be. You know, Islam could be a religion of peace, perhaps. Jihad could be just an inner spiritual struggle and have nothing to do with holy war. Indeed, that we have to raise a generation of Muslims who believe those things. But pretending that it is already is problematic because it isn't for so many millions of Muslims. And it may be that if you pretend hard enough, in fact, you become what you pretend to be. And maybe that's part of the process. But I think we have to admit to ourselves that we are confronting the behavior of a death cult among millions and millions of Muslims, not 10,000 who went to training camps in Afghanistan. We are confronting an endorsement of this kind of behavior and a reflexive political solidarity where Muslims side with other Muslims, no matter how sociopathic their behavior, simply because they're other Muslims. We can't deny the problem while trying to encourage a more benign face of the religion.
One thing you can say against neoconservatism, which is that it is idealistic to a degree that now seems not at all sustainable. I mean, we should have learned a lesson at this point, which is we don't do this very well. We don't nation build very well. We have a political environment where we just can't stay committed to these things, even if we were doing it well. You know, we view everything through a 4-year, presidential lens,
right?
An election cycle, and these are multi-decade commitments if we're going to do this well. So, but Iraq looks like a disaster, and it's looked like a disaster for most of the time, apart from 15 minutes there after the surge. And I certainly don't consider myself a neocon. I just think we have to be honest about, in ethical terms, what is really going on in the world. If you're going to say that we never should have gone into Iraq, which I think is a reasonable thing to say, and it was a reasonable thing to say then, it was only decent to admit how depressing a claim this really is. I mean, so we're saying that Iraq is a place that requires a psychopathic thug to run it. I mean, given the level of religious sectarianism, given the fact that when you remove a butcher like Saddam Hussein, everyone starts killing their neighbor, right? Which is in fact what happened, and which is in fact the political and religious reality we underestimated when we walked in there thinking that they were just going to put flowers in the barrels of our guns and welcome us as liberators. So it's a very depressing thing to admit about the state of a place like Iraq. But I think we should all. I mean, I view Iraq as initially when Saddam was there as a kind of hostage crisis. You have a totally illegitimate regime run by barbarians, keeping tens of millions of people hostage, and so the people who criticize the war based on saying that it was a sovereign government and we should never have gone in there, because it's not. That's just a failure to engage with the moral reality, which is this was a terrible place to live, and if we could have done something to help these people, we should have. And there are many countries that fit that description. I mean, North Korea is one of them. If there would be some way to depose that regime and liberate the North Koreans, we should do it. Now, we know that it would just be a bloody mess if we tried, and we're learning that more and more in these other societies. But and so neoconservatism, I don't know what its current state is now, but I can't imagine anyone is, even Wolfowitz or Pearl I can't imagine any of them are as sanguine about the possibility of building a nation anywhere from scratch. But the idea that we created ISIS by going into Iraq, that's also just delusional. I mean, the set of ideas that gives us ISIS, that is the set of ideas and the level of sectarianism that gave us the civil war that we could barely contain, that drove us out of Iraq. And that set of ideas, in one or another degree, has been animating subset of the Muslim world for a very long time.
Just pure you could have justified a war in Iraq for purely humanitarian reasons. Now, I'm not saying, now, again, this is a point of confusion. I'm not saying that we went in purely for humanitarian reasons, but I'm saying you could have. You could have looked at this just as I described North Korea as a hostage crisis. And this guy's a bad actor. He keeps shooting, trying to shoot down our planes, enforcing a no-fly zone. You could have, the civilized world could have said, we're going to remove this guy. And just appealed to all of the Iraqis on the ground to just watch us do it, right? Don't fight us. We're gonna take it. The Wicked Witch of the West is going to be dead in a fortnight. That could have been a completely benevolent thing to do, but again, here is where we have to be honest about the role that Islam plays in making this unworkable. That was just the sheer fact of infidels doing it was a sacrilege to a significant percentage of the Muslim world. You had Muslims who on Wednesday hated Saddam Hussein as an insufficiently Muslim tyrant, who on Thursday were behind him because he was being attacked by infidels, right?
No, but Sam, I disagree with that analysis, and I'll tell you why. Because we liberated, okay, and it's got its own problems, etc., but roughly so, Bosnia, Kosovo, right? Yeah. We did that. They were Muslim. We helped them, and we were not perceived as infidels. We were not perceived as hostile. We were perceived as enormously friendly to the Muslims.
We did not invade Muslim land. That is different. We did not invade Muslim land, and we really don't get credit for that. I mean, the Muslim world doesn't give the West credit for the liberation.
Certainly did, and the people in Kosovo did. And so my point there, Sam, is that it is not a universal Muslim reaction. It depends on the political context.
Well, I'm not saying
where
it's
we
universal.
actually helped the Bosnians and the people of Kosovo, we were thanked by those people, right? When we went to Iraq, and we have a long history of doing that for corporate reasons, for reasons of subjugation, etc., we were justifiably and correctly viewed with enormous skepticism. And they were roughly right.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that. But but yeah, I think you're downplaying the degree to which there is a, and again, this doesn't speak so much to specific doctrines. This speaks to tribal solidarity based on religion, more like what was happening in Northern Ireland. You have a reflexive solidarity, you have an in-group, out-group thinking where you have Muslims and people of all religions, but especially Muslims at this moment in history, siding with other Muslims just because they're Muslims, no matter how badly behaved they are. It's just a fact that a commitment to jihad, a support for jihad, is uncoupled from economics, and it's uncoupled from education. As economics go up and education go up, a radicalism goes up. This is not the poorest of the poor who are the jihadists. It's the engineers who are the jihadists. And that's a so this again. This is a very PC fantasy, which it would be great if it were true.
We're talking about micro and macro issues. You're talking about a micro issue of that particular engineer or doctor doing what he does, right? Whereas I'm talking about macro issues of a country that is doing economically better is less likely to produce a culture that is steeped in jihad, etc. So
I certainly hope that's true. I don't know that we know that that's true.
Okay, and so that is why the culture matters more than the religion does, and I think the geopolitical context matters more than the religion does.
So my bias toward Israel, whenever you're talking about the conflict between Israel and her neighbors, my bias towards Israel is really a bias against suicide bombing and the use of human shields and an explicitly genocidal aspiration, which Hamas has in its charter, and many of Israel's antagonists have just in the way they talk about the fate of the Jews. I mean, it is prophesied that the end times will come when the very earth cries out against the Jews, where the trees and the rocks say, "There's a Jew behind me, come kill him." I mean, that is like center of the fairway Islamic prophecy, right? And it's in the charter of Hamas, right? So how can Israel expect to deal with these people, right?
So I think you illustrated in that piece that if the weapons were reversed, if the Israelis had the weapons that Hamas has and Hamas had the weapons the Israelis had, well, this thing would be over tomorrow because there would be a genocide tomorrow, which to me sort of sums up why this conversation is so silly.
That is the moral disparity that all of Israel's critics have to admit to be intellectually honest here.
All right. Well, it's going to take me a minute to process that because my brain is in recovery mode from the high-level important ideas. So, you guys have thoughts, Djene?
Well, where to begin? I mean,
yeah, that's the problem.
Yes, where to begin? There's both the kind of misconceptions about Islam and understanding, what Islam is as a historical phenomena, as a broad religion that has many, many different faces and that has existed in many different ways throughout various historical eras, and its kind of reduction to a couple of surah from the Quran or some particular hadith that he's picked out. What I would probably sort of start with, perhaps, is to talk about his general conception of Islam, which is a very it's a very ahistorical and mechanical understanding of Islam, based on his particular selective readings of certain verses. I will sort of point out here that I do not, although my father's family is of Muslim origin, I don't regard myself as being a Muslim, and I wasn't raised in a Muslim household. And in fact, my father was particularly anti-religious in this sense, in a sense. And I personally don't believe, that basing one's morality on, sort of religious beliefs from the late antiquity is particularly helpful. But that being said, it is such a reductionist argument to make these claims about the Islamic community, 1 billion people, which includes an enormous amount of diversity, and that has existed, in various parts of the world in various different ways for, a millennia and a half. For example, he talks about it as even if we take his view that there are things in the Quran that are pretty distasteful, look historically. The vast majority of Muslims, for most of history, were largely illiterate. Their versions of Islam were folk Islam, Sufism. There was a large body of judicial interpretation. Even when we look at the actions of ISIS, for example, ISIS destroyed all these pre-Islamic sites in Iraq. The Taliban, destroyed Buddhist sites in Afghanistan. Well, is that something inherent to Islam? Because those things, those sites that were destroyed by ISIS survived the early Islamic conquests, right? It was one generation after Muhammad that Iraq was conquered by the armies of Islam, and most of those historical sites remained intact. So he has this very simplistic understanding of Islam based on a kind of decontextualized understanding of certain verses of the Quran without a knowledge of how Islam has been practiced. And ironically, it is his understanding of Islam is the kind of Salafi Takfiri version of Islam that ISIS advocates. The irony is that, he is kind of implying that ISIS are the ones who are practicing Islam properly, and sort of other forms of Islam are less true Islam because they don't follow the most violent statements that you find in the Quran. And I think, and my suspicion is that this comes out of a kind of 19th, 20th century positivist kind of thinking. If you look at many of the jihadists, he made the point that, most of these jihadists are not from, the poorest backgrounds, which, yes, in certain cases is true. But many of them come from engineering and medical backgrounds where they have this particular way of learning. And Sam Harris has that sort of same kind of scientific training. He believes that you can sort of conjure up a transhistoric understanding of a religious text, get to its essential truth, by reading it and understanding it in a scientific way. And so this leads him to this conclusion that the most violent portions of sort of interpretations of Islam are the truest. He doesn't say this overtly, but this seems to be this kind of tenor of it.
Seems to be his view, right? Like that, that he does talk, like, sure, in parts of that you got certain qualifications, a certain subset of, Muslims and things like that, but it's also, he also says things like, of course, we're not going to play this because I think there would most certainly be a copyright issue. But on Bill Maher, when he talked about, he said Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas. And of course, it is absolutely true that there are, there are things in the Quran and especially in the Hadiths that, that are, blood-curdlingly awful, which it has in common, with the Old and New Testaments, the Talmud, etc. Like all of these ancient texts have blood-curdlingly awful things, in certain passages of them. There are, there are like, anti-Semites in Europe had tons of stuff, had definitely had passages in the New Testament to work with, that in fact, in many ways, they were giving the most natural interpretation of
slave owners.
Yeah, slaveholders, right? That's, clearly that, that in the Old Testament, there's not only the sort of strange omission, right? I mean, if I were narrowing it down to the 10 most important moral rules to give to people, I think I might include don't enslave people. But not only is that not in there, but there are rules about how, like slaves obey their masters and returning, escaped slaves and things like that in there. There are passages, there are passages that are in the Old Testament where God commands the ancient Israelites to commit genocide, against the Canaanites and Amalekites. And there are like ultra-Orthodox rabbis of the West Bank today who argue that, that like Palestinians, fall into those categories and that you should still, follow it. And of course, there are also in all of these texts, there are passages that, that have, that suggest much more benevolent things. And yeah, I mean, it seems like a really weird thing to do, to essentially seem to suggest, or at least heavily imply, that they're like, I mean, if you're not a Muslim, what does it even mean to say out of this incredibly ancient, diverse, multifaceted religious tradition that there's like a true version of it, right? Like, because it can't mean that like that's the one that God intended, right? Like if you're an atheist, there is no one that God intended. So I don't understand that. I mean, I just say in all of these cases, yeah, you find like, some positive values expressed at certain places. You find some god awful values expressed in certain places, and you have people at different times in history for different reasons who emphasize one or the other. But I mean,
it's that bit that Harris really likes to ignore, right? I mean, this is, again, this is not my area of expertise, but this is something that's really endemic to Harris's treatment of a lot of intellectual topics, is that he just likes to ignore all the context. And it's especially relevant here in the context of Islam. The fact that Islam has these violent expressions is not coincidental that those expressions come to fruition during certain historical times in reaction, or at least in relation in some way, to a history of colonialism. If we want to talk about Islam and try to reach a judgment about whether or not Islam is good or bad, as if you could do something so reductive, you at least have to talk about the historical vagaries that leads to certain kinds of expressions of different religions across time. And he just ignores that.
Yeah, the thing I've always wondered about this interpretation is like, why is it that you think like if the line you're drawing is between like the worst passages in the Hadiths and Al-Qaeda or ISIS, then why is it that Al-Qaeda didn't exist until the 1990s, right? That's a lot of centuries in between one and the other, right? Like, why weren't there suicide attacks, going on in, whatever, colonial Williamsburg, that like, I mean, people had shipping, they could make their way over. It's just kind of a mystery on this view.
Yeah, well, these are the first true Muslims. They finally arose in the 1990s. Yeah, no, it's the thing about this that, and we'll come back to this again and again with these other topics we're going to talk about. It's just how like smug and confident he is when he's making proclamations in huge areas of study that he clearly just has a very shallow grasp of. And it won't bother him that a bunch of religious studies experts are going to tell him he's mischaracterizing Islam. It won't bother him that a bunch of philosophers tell him he's mischaracterizing views about free will or about ethics. None of that bothers him. He's just so sure of himself that's the thing about him that bugs me more than anything else. It's just that insane level of undeserved confidence in all these areas.
There's a certain intellectual style that he follows, and I see this amongst not just Sam Harris, but amongst brand of liberal, as well as amongst, and I don't like to use the term privileged, but upper class white men, and I use this very sparingly, but see, look, I kind of looked at this superficially and I thought about it for a long time. It's very common amongst libertarians, and I thought about it, and I've come to this very deep conclusion, which the more that which is based on very superficial knowledge. So the more you study, the more that you study a subject, the less confident you become. That's what. As I study, history more, the less confident I become about my knowledge. But if you have a very superficial understanding, and I'm slagging off men here, but I actually have in my mind, I have a friend who is like an extremely wealthy libertarian who is like always making the claims that, well, I've thought about it. How dare you say that my ideas are the product of circumstances? I've thought about these. Sam Harris has read a couple of about Islam. He's had a look at the Quran, and like a superficial look at the Quran. I remember one friend of mine at university sat down, read it, and he goes, "Oh, this is like a book for pirates." I could see how you might come up with that interpretation, but it's a vast oversimplification. And as Mark pointed out, it totally decontextualizes things from the historical context. And if I might talk specifically about what he talked about with Iraq, was that he talks about Iraq as if there's these kind of time immemorial religious divides in the country, and that it took Saddam Hussein to crush that down. And how sad is that? Islam is so violent. The sectarianism has existed in the Islamic world since the very earliest days of Islam. But if we look at the context of the Sunni-Shia divide in Iraq, firstly, the Sunni-Shia divide in Iraq really takes off in the early modern period with the mass conversion of Iran to Shiaism and the rise of Sunnism as the kind of official ideology of the Ottoman Empire. And then under the colonial period, where European powers, favored certain sectarian groups over others. And then the post-colonial states continued many of those same policies, exacerbating things. If you look at, if you want to talk about Islam and how it can be contradictory, just as sort of you have this radical strain of Islamism that is extremely violent, which I personally regard as kind of a hybrid between sort of the most reactionary and conservative elements of Islamic thought and hardcore right-wing conservative nationalism. But if we look at, you have other strains. Throughout the 19th century, you had Islamic justifications for constitutional government. In Iran, the first constitutional revolution in 1905 was pioneered by members of the ulama who pushed for constitutional government, arguing that it was entirely appropriate according to Islamic law. It's one of the first big political mobilizations of Iran in the 1890s, led by the ulama, was motivated by a British control over the tobacco concession in the country. And if you look even at the ideologies and the statements of groups like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, their grievances related to European imperialism and colonialism primarily. Now, of course, they use certain verses of the Quran to justify brutalities against particular groups. But, they talk about abolishing the Sykes-Picot borders, ejecting America from the and things like this. So this is a metastasization of, a reactionary strain of religious thinking and modern nationalism, anti-colonialism, and so on and so forth. If you go to the Iranian Revolution again, if you look at Khomeini, he cribbed a lot of from the political left, reinterpreting the struggle between Mecca and Medina as being class war, and so kind of pulling that kind of left-wing populist angle as well. So viewing Islam's and I am not a supporter of political Islam, and I tend to see the politicization of religion as a dangerous political phenomenon, but I don't think that's inherent to Islam. If you look at the United States of America, we see very pernicious forms of politicized Christianity. And so, I think we have to, we can be critical of political trends in Islam. We can be suspicious of political Islam, but condemning 1 billion people for their piety and having this kind of Bill Maher liberalism where you're like, look at these dummies and their stupid beliefs. And because that's all that Sam Harris is a more intellectualized version of Bill Maher liberalism. It's counterproductive. It just reeks of kind of arrogance and a kind of lack of self-reflection. When we look at most of the brutalities that have taken place in the 20th century, a lot of them have been related to perfectly secular ideologies. Even many of the brutalities in the Islamic world itself were motivated and orchestrated by secular political groups. If you look at genocide, yes, the Ottoman government sort of mobilized Islamic resentment against Armenians, but the orchestrators of the genocide were kind of social Darwinists, thinkers who saw the Armenians as some kind of cancer on the body of the Ottoman nation, and so sought to promote ethnic conflict. So the orchestrators were not deeply pious Muslims, but people who were kind of taking on these social Darwinistic ideas that were popular across the West in the late 19th century. So it's such an ahistorical and ignorant understanding of the role of Islam. And often, I think people on the left, we're in this difficult position because we want to strike this balance between not conceding to reactionary religious political trends, but at the same time not reducing people's personal pieties and religious beliefs to terrorism.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting with that Iraq comment at the beginning of the supercut that it's just obviously a false dichotomy. This always drove me crazy that people would say, "Oh, you're against invading Iraq, so what you want is for Saddam Hussein to rule Iraq forever." And of course, that doesn't follow. In fact, in a parallel timeline where the Iraq War never happened, especially frankly, if we'd lifted sanctions and given people that kind of breather, I think it's entirely possible. Who knows? Obviously, but it doesn't seem a priori out of the question that Saddam Hussein would have been overthrown like Mubarak was in Egypt. That doesn't seem impossible, or that there could have been even like this is obviously not a positive model, but even that there could have been like a domestic bloodier version of that, like what happened in Syria, which ultimately left Assad in power. But that was there was a bitter struggle there, right? There are things that lead to dictators being removed other than your country being cluster bombed, invaded, and occupied by a foreign power.
Yeah, that reminds me, one of the things that he was bothered by about Saddam was the fact that Saddam reacted to our no-fly zones.
Yeah.
Which is an act of war. That's an act of war right there. And the fact that he wouldn't just submit to that act of war was one strike against him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's also bizarre that he is attributed to this sort of whatever, he's attributed to Islam apparently in those clips the fact that Iraqis who are opposed to Saddam Hussein nonetheless took up arms to resist a foreign invasion and occupation of their country, which literally anybody in any country would do, right? If somebody
that's true Islam, just like Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, Sam Harris hated Trump to a very deep extent. He said somewhere that that actually he thinks that Trump was worse than Osama bin Laden. But I'm pretty sure if Chinese troops had invaded the United States to depose Donald Trump, Sam Harris would support local resistance to that, because generally speaking, most human beings don't like it when their countries are conquered.
So you're saying Sam Harris would have become a Muslim in that case?
Yes, you have got me exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Got it.
Yeah, I want to express the true version of atheism, which is violent and angry and terroristic.
And one of the reasons that sort of political Islam became so powerful in places like Iraq was because it ended up being one of the only places where you could have some kind of opposition to the state. Most of the political movements that existed, the communists, the social democrats, secular nationalists, those groups were all crushed. And so the mosque became one of the few areas where you could orchestrate resistance. This is why in Egypt you ended up with the Muslim Brotherhood, with its strong grassroots organizing as being, the group was able to take advantage of the, ouster of Hosni Mubarak. So, it is, and, he says, like, America is not to blame for ISIS. America is actually, quite to blame for ISIS because, Saddam Hussein was pretty tough on these guys because obviously he didn't like them and they didn't like him. But, when the United States came and basically disbanded the Iraqi state, you created conditions in which a group like ISIS could take place. The United States was not the only factor in the creation of ISIS. But, you go back even to Afghanistan, where many of these radical groups got their training. The United States didn't create the Mujahideen, but, they dedicated Rambo 3 to the Mujahideen, right? So, you have all these complicated
and to a certain extent, the United States did kind of create the Mujahideen. Like, there were, at the very least, the more careful claim would be that that the United States, of course, armed and funded the Mujahideen, and also that in pursuit of this, right? Chomsky talks about this. Saudi Arabia, certainly, some other U.S. allies were doing things like emptying all of their sort of most deranged, fundamentalist dissident prisoners out of the prisons to say, hey, you want to get out of prison and you can go do holy war in Afghanistan, go nuts, right? So certainly at the very least, these US client states in coordination with the United States to a very real extent did help to create the Mujahideen.
Yeah, and it helped to give them the prestige they needed to continue around the world. So, when you look at these radical Islamic groups, I think there is a kind of interesting sort of parallel between the rise of kind of radical Islamic internationalism and sort of neoconservatism. Just as the neoconservatives believed that they could go around the world, promoting their ideology and reforging states, because I think, the neoconservative project was not purely an economic project. It was an idealistic project as well, one that was, deeply flawed. But, the Islamists adopted the same kind of vocabulary that this was an international struggle to create a kind of Islamic state free of Western hegemony. So that they take on the sort of vocabulary and cultural ammunition of Islamic history is not strange. People often frame, the United States framed its war against Iraq in World War II with reference to World War II, right? So Islamic movements framed their conflict with the West in terms of the language of the early Islamic conquests. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is not called Abu Bakr by accident. He's named for one of the early caliphs, right? So, they take this kind of history and they use it for their own political ends. That doesn't mean that's the be-all and end-all of Islam. You go across the Islamic world and you see enormous historical diversity on issues. For example, one of the popular things to go on is in the Islamic world, they murder all the gays. And it's like, well, yes, there's a deeply reactionary sort of anti-gay trend in Islamic politics today. But if you go to various parts of the Islamic world, there are quite different attitudes. You know, historically, there were different attitudes towards homosexuality. In the Ottoman Empire, homosexuality up until the 19th century and the imposition of sort of Victorian morals on the country, homosexuality was practiced widely and socially acceptable amongst the elites of the empire. If you go to places like Indonesia, in certain parts of Indonesia, the religious leaders of certain religious Sufi groups were transgender. And even in Iran, you know, homosexuality is illegal, but transgender surgery is perfectly permissible. So,
no,
you know,
in fact, my understanding is that in a very weird way, the two go together in Iran. That say, oh, you're attracted to you know, you're a woman, and you know, you're attracted to other women. You know, you must really be male on the inside. Let's do some corrective surgery, and we could sort this out.
There's one, you know, there's over 1,000 years of judicial interpretation, of spiritual innovation within the Islamic world. And there's enormous amount, and I would come back to this point, there's just an enormous amount of diversity. And this kind of cheap reductionism is both wrong from a kind of scientific perspective, if I may use that word, but also leads to bad politics and a bad understanding. And I'll give you one example. When I worked in Iraq, you know, I was working at the American University, and, you know, there would be a lot of journalists would come through looking for a quote, right? They would want to come and find someone who's a historian, and they would come to me and they ask for a quote. And the quote they would want me to say is that, oh, the conflict between Sunni and Shia is like, goes back to the, you know, 7th century post-Islamic era. And they would get very kind of like upset that not upset, but they would be unsatisfied that my answer would tend to revolve around the particular policies of colonial governments and post-colonial governments in mobilizing sectarian identity, not even in a theological sense, but in the sense of creating a group which would give you access to certain benefits and things. So it's not even that people are particularly super religious, but if you were part of a particular group, had the right familial connections, that you would get access to certain resources. So it's not even a deep deal. You know, people aren't murdering each other in Iraq because, you know, an Islamic leader was murdered 1,500 years ago in a mosque, right? It's not why people are killing each other. That might be a kind of motif used in the discourse, but that's not the fundamental reason behind it. The reason people in Israel, Palestine are fighting fundamentally is, you know, there may be Islamic motifs and more Islamic motifs today as political Islam becomes more prestigious, but it's ultimately a fight over land and who gets control of land and resources in a very small piece of land. And just as religion is mobilized by the religion and history is mobilized by Muslim elements in the Palestinian population, Judaism is mobilized by Jewish elements
yeah, and that's also like very closely parallel actually with the Mujahideen example, because, you know, it's a matter of uncontroversial historical record that in the 1980s the Mossad, you know, was actually propping up Hamas in order to, as a divide and conquer thing, you know, to undermine, you know, secular and socialist versions of Palestinian nationalism that were much more popular at that point.
And if we look at the origins of Zionism, it's not religious. It's because Jews were persecuted in Europe, as, you know, they couldn't assimilate. So, you know, the origins of Zionism isn't even religious.
No, it was an overwhelmingly secular movement for up until about the 1960s. You know, so yeah, no, that's totally right, and I think it's also worth, and I'm glad you brought back up the Palestine example, because in that 10 minutes of just nonsense, that was that's something that was heavily touched on that we should talk about before we move on. But I did just want to say on the subject of the rise of ISIS, you know, like, I mean, I think the even more pertinent thing is just that the United States punched a hole in the region and created these conditions of bloodshed and civil war in which a group like that could thrive. And it's, you know, I mean, like, you could imagine, like, in some god-awful, like, dystopian novel, some sequence of events in the United States where there was so much chaos and bloodshed and desperation that some group with, like, the ideology of the Westboro Baptist Church, you know, became, like, a really popular militia. And in describing that, you could say, oh, see, this is because in, you know, in the Old Testament, you know, and a little bit in the New, there are these passages about homosexuality, and really the Westboro Baptists are actually offering the most, like, straightforward interpretation of those passages, which is, which is true enough. And so really, it's not that there was whatever war or whatever happened to lead to this. It's just that, like, Christianity existed, and that's the explanation of the Westboro militia taking over, you know, multiple states. And it really is just silly on that level to say that, like, no, it's not that this invasion, you know, occupation, civil war, which, by the way, civil war that, you know, like, U.S. policy in Iraq after the invasion was really, in a lot of ways, intentionally exacerbating and playing up, you know, sectarian divisions and the way the country was governed, you know, at that point. Like, that it's not all that, right? It's just Islam, right? That, like, Islam exists, therefore ISIS arose in the 2010s.
Yeah. I mean, you know, even on the face of it, it makes no sense, because if Iraq was entirely governed by Islam, then you know, what explains the conflict between Kurds and Sunni Arabs? Kurds are Sunnis, Arabs in Iraq are Sunnis, but some of the most vicious fighting historically has been between Sunni Kurds and Sunni Arabs, with, you know, certain factions of the Shia wing of Iraqi politics being quite supportive. The Al-Hakim family was very supportive of the Kurdish movement. Shia Iran was supportive of, you know, it's like, when you get down to these kind of, when you get down to it, the reduction of the Middle East to kind of sectarian conflicts, it doesn't even work on the face of it. You know, the notion that you have, like, this big struggle between Sunnis and Shias makes no sense, right? Because you have you know, Shia Iran supporting groups like Hamas that are Sunnis and have historically clashed with each other. You have countries like Turkey supporting Azerbaijan, although they're both Turkish. Up until the 19th century, Azeris would have hated, in fact, Azeris were one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire didn't expand further eastwards, because they were the bulwark of Shiaism against the expansion of the Sunni Ottomans. So none of these kind of, like, trite interpretations that of the role of religion in Middle Eastern politics really work out when you get to the nuts and bolts. Sectarianism and religion do matter. They do need to be taken seriously, but they have to be contextualized, understood, and they cannot be essentialized. And if I might pivot to something that that might, like, bring everybody else in, and I think we're going to talk about it a little bit more when we talk about torture, is also Sam Harris's fetishization of particular types of violence as being somehow worse than other types of violence. And, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, suicide bombing is good, or like, you know, the kind of rape and brutality that we've seen from certain Islamic groups like ISIS, the genocidal campaigns that they've launched, you know, are permissible. But when it comes down to violence, you know, is like burning a bunch of people alive with a cluster bomb dropped from a couple of thousand feet, does that make that much of a difference to whether you get your head chopped off? You know, is a suicide bomb worse than a artillery shell fired into a civilian zone? I don't know exactly if it makes that much difference. What I suspect is, like, the violence of those people that don't have power tends to be more, you know, desperate and you know, can look worse. But is the kind of clinical violence of the drone strike some kind of magnitude better than, you know, stabbing someone to death? I don't have answers to it, but it seems entirely arbitrary.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is what there's a wonderful letter exchange between Harris and Noam Chomsky, which email exchange, which actually is very funny because the way it ends is Harris, you know, asking if he could post it online, and Chomsky being like, well, that's a bizarre thing to want to do, but I guess, right, go nuts. And in that letter exchange, you know, they're going back and forth, and Chomsky is trying to get him to understand something like incredibly simple, which is that it's not, you know, Harris will talk about intentions like, oh, we don't want to, you know, kill civilians, you know, whereas, you know, Al-Qaeda, you know, does. So this is a really important, you know, moral difference. And the only moral distinction Harris is willing to make is having your goal be to kill civilians and having that not be your goal. That's it, right? And the very simple point that Chomsky really wants to drive home is it's also incredibly morally objectionable. In fact, in some ways, like really disturbing to just be callously indifferent to the fact that you're killing lots of civilians, to just sort of treat them like ants that you're stepping on and, you know, whatever, you know, that, like, you're not worried about it. And Harris just cannot for the life of him, you know, like, acknowledge that. You know, he just sort of goes back and repeats his earlier points, even though it's incredibly intuitive. And this also goes, you know, your point about desperation, I think, is really important because, you know, Harris has that incredibly simplistic hypothetical about, oh, what if like the Palestinians had all the advanced weapons, you know, that the Israelis have, you know, they'd wipe them out. And it's like, well, under what circumstances are we talking about? Like that, like the, you know, Palestinians, the same ones who have been living as subjects but not citizens of a hostile power, subject to arbitrary killing with no legal recourse, etc., for several decades. Those Palestinians got like that advanced weaponry and had like, okay, this is your one shot? Or are we talking about a scenario whereby, I don't know, the 1967 war had gone the other way and the actual power relations were reversed? In which case, I would say, what's your basis for thinking that? Because there are, you know, I mean, certainly before the creation of Israel, you know, there were various Arab and Muslim states, you know, that had substantial Jewish populations and, you know, who were often mistreated and discriminated against in various ways, and, you know, second-class citizens, you know, much like even those Palestinians who were lucky enough to have Israeli citizenship, you know, but they weren't like just wiped out, right? Like that's so. I mean, I don't know what, like, if in this scenario we're imagining the actual opposite power relations and opposite history, and not just the weapons being in the other hands. I just don't know what his basis is for thinking that.
It's this kind of Harris's deafness to nuance and context. You know, if Ryan came to my house and just beat the crap out of me every day, and I couldn't do anything about it because he's just so much bigger and stronger than I am. But every time he did it, I would scream at him, "I'm going to fucking kill you." You know, and you watched from the sidelines and thought to yourself, well, I don't like Ryan beating Mark up. I know he's got his reasons, and that's a problem. But if Mark was as big and strong as Ryan, he just said he'd fucking kill Ryan. And Ryan is doing a lot here. It's not great, but he's not killing Mark.
Well, you have to add something here. That Ryan is also crying and saying, "Why are you making me do this?"
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
He's punching in the face and saying, "Why are you making me do this? I don't want to do this to you."
Yeah.
But
why are you hitting yourself?
Why are you hitting yourself? Why are you doing this on yourself? It's kind of perverse. It's kind of perverse logic about violence and the way, you know, violence looks. It's like, I remember one person, you know, a friend of mine who's a veteran was like, you know, in Afghanistan, the Taliban, they were cowards. They would like hide and they would shoot at us and they would never come face us one to one. I was like, what do you expect them to do? Like, they're not idiots, you know, like, you know, like they're going to fight an asymmetrical war with you, because if they like march out there and have like a weightlifting contest, or like they try and run their like tanks at you, they're not going to win. So of course their violence is going to look different from the kind of violence. It's not a moral judgment. It's just the nature of asymmetrical warfare. Like, you know, from the British perspective, look at all the terrorism that the American colonists perpetrated and gone towards the brave redcoats who were merely trying to secure the order of good King George's empire. You know, I've seen The Patriot. I've seen what goes on in that movie. So, you know, it would be ridiculous. You know, it would have been ridiculous if the Americans had tried to fight the American Revolution entirely through conventional battles of the 18th century variety, whereby they agreed to meet up at a certain time and space and fire their cannons and charge their cavalry at each other. So it's yeah, it comes down to Sam Harris like not really refusing to, like, he's so much smarter than all of us, and why can't we just see things from his perspective? Why can't we? I mean, I think Adolf Reed has a saying, like, and I may be paraphrasing this, but like, you know, good intentions are really overrated, because, you know, at some point, you know, good intentions lead to really not good things. So, you know, yes, sometimes what's in people's hearts matters, I guess, but does it really matter that much if it's at the end of the day? You know, like, I remember reading something about, you know, justifications that Germans gave for shooting children. And it was like, oh, well, you know, like, this kid had his mother killed, so I thought it would just kinda to shoot the child. It's like, well, you know, like, whatever you need to do to justify yourself. And there is something, you know, at least with Islamic violence, that it's like up front, there's something really quite scary about the way that people can, you know, make justifications, make justifications for violence, and you know, have all these euphemisms for violence. That doesn't mean violence isn't sometimes required, or there might not be examples of violence that, you know, we might see as legitimate. But let's be honest about what violence looks like, and, you know, be perhaps less concerned with, like, what's in people's hearts when they commit atrocious acts of violence.